The morning Marlene Baxter put a padlock on my propane shed. The temperature outside was sitting at -4 degrees Fahrenheit. The roads into town were completely buried under 2 feet of fresh snow, and my neighbor 3 doors down had already lost heat overnight. I know all of this because I was awake at 5 in the morning drinking coffee and watching the blizzard through my kitchen window, thinking this was exactly the kind of storm that separates the prepared from the unprepared. What I did not expect, not in a million years, was that the biggest threat to my neighborhood that morning would not be the storm itself. It would be a woman in a puffy pink parka with an HOA badge clipped to her chest, carrying a bolt cutter and a brand new combination padlock, stomping through knee-deep snow toward the back corner of my property like she owned the place. Because in her mind, she did. My name is Kevin Wells. I have lived in the Pinecrest Ridge subdivision for going on 7 years now. It is one of those planned communities that looks real nice in the summer brochures, the kind with matching mailboxes and quarterly newsletters about gutter colors. The HOA here has always been a little aggressive, but for most of my time in this neighborhood, it was manageable. Annoying, sure, but manageable. That all changed when Marlene Baxter got voted onto the HOA board about 2 years back and immediately started treating the position like a cabinet-level government appointment. She reorganized the fine structure, introduced new violation categories, and began conducting what she called compliance walks twice a week, which was really just her wandering around the neighborhood with a clipboard looking for things to write people up about. I had crossed paths with Marlene before over smaller stuff. She had cited me once for having a garden hose that was not completely coiled and put away. She tried to find me another time because she claimed my front door trim was the wrong shade of beige, even though I had the original builder's color code documented and could prove it matched exactly. Both of those went nowhere because I always kept records. That is just how I operate. I photograph everything, I save every letter. I read the CC and RS cover to cover, and I keep a folder on my computer labeled HOA nonsense, where I store all of it. This habit, which Marlene probably found irritating, was about to become the most important thing I had ever done in my adult life. Now, before I get into what she actually did, let me explain the propane shed situation so you have the full picture. 3 years ago, after a particularly brutal winter where our neighborhood gas lines were strained, and one family on my street actually ran out of heat for 4 days, I decided to invest in a backup propane system. I had a small wooden shed built in the back corner of my property, properly permitted through the county, setback from the property line according to code, fire-resistant interior, and ventilated appropriately. Inside that shed I keep several large propane tanks that feed both a backup generator and a propane heater system I can run independently of the main gas line. The whole setup cost me a serious amount of money, and I was proud of it. During power outages and gas disruptions, my house stays warm. My pipes do not freeze. I can cook and shower and keep my family comfortable while the rest of the street is scrambling. Here is the part Marlene did not know. Every single propane tank in that shed is connected to a digital monitoring system. The company that fills and maintains my tanks installed wireless sensors on each one that track pressure levels, usage rates, temperature inside the shed, and whether the shed door has been opened or tampered with. The system sends alerts directly to my phone. I can log into an app and see the real-time status of every tank at any moment. I got this system because the propane company offers it as a safety feature, and I thought it was a great idea. Turns out it was an even better idea than I realized. The blizzard had started the night before, and by midnight it was serious. I'm talking horizontal snow, wind gusts that were shaking the windows, and temperatures dropping fast. I had already checked on all my neighbors earlier in the evening, making sure the older couple at the end of the block, the Hendersons, had enough propane and that their heating system was running. I had also texted a few other folks on the street to let them know I had backup heat if anyone needed it. That is just what you do when you have the means and your neighbors might be struggling. I was up early because I had already decided I was going to spend the morning helping people dig out and checking in on everyone. At around 5:15 in the morning, I was on my second cup of coffee when my phone buzzed on the counter. It was my propane monitoring app. The alert read, "Shed door access detected. Door has been opened." Followed about 40 seconds later by, "External locking mechanism detected on door sensor. Door appears secured from outside." I stared at my phone for a second. Then I read it again. Then I walked to my back window and peered through the snow and the dark, and sure enough, through the gray pre-dawn light and the still falling snow, I could see a flashlight moving around near my shed. And then I could see the figure in the pink parka trudging away through the snow back toward the street. I grabbed my coat and my boots and went outside. The cold hit me like a wall. It was the kind of cold that makes your nose hairs freeze the second you inhale, where the snow squeaks under your boots instead of crunching. I walked around to the back of my property and found, exactly as the app had told me, a brand new combination padlock threaded through the latch on my shed door, locked tight. The lock was not mine. I did not own a pink combination lock with little snowflake patterns on it, which is what this one was, and I am fairly certain that tells you everything you need to know about who put it there. I went back inside, made a third cup of coffee, sat down at my kitchen table, and opened my laptop. I logged into the shed monitoring system and pulled up the access log. It showed the exact timestamp of the door being opened, the duration the door was held open, and then the door secured event. It also showed something I had not noticed before on the app, which was that the sensors inside had detected a disturbance consistent with something being moved, meaning someone had not just opened the door. Someone had actually gone inside. I pulled up the outdoor security camera feed I have mounted on the back corner of my house, which covers the yard and the shed area, and I watched the whole thing play out on my screen in crisp 1080p video with timestamps. Marlene Baxter, unmistakable in her pink parka, walked up to my shed, used what appeared to be a bolt cutter to remove my existing latch pin, went inside, was in there for about 2 minutes, came back out, installed her padlock, tested it, and walked away. I sat there for a moment just appreciating the situation. Outside, a blizzard was raging. The roads were impassable, and Marlene Baxter had apparently decided that this was the perfect morning to claim my propane shed. Now, I want to make sure you understand why this mattered beyond just the obvious trespass. It was -4 degrees outside and dropping. My propane system was what several neighbors were potentially going to need that day. The Henderson's heating system had been showing some strain, and I was already half expecting them to need a hookup to my backup line. And here was the HOA board president putting a lock on the storage shed that contained the equipment that could keep people warm, in a blizzard, during a state-declared winter emergency. I called Marlene's cell phone. She did not pick up. I called the HOA main contact number and left a message. Then I put my boots back on, walked 3 houses down to Marlene's house, and knocked on her door. She answered it wearing what appeared to be a matching pink robe and slippers, and holding a mug of tea like she was having a perfectly peaceful morning. She looked at me standing on her porch, snow swirling around me, and she actually smiled. "Kevin," she said pleasantly, "isn't it terrible out there? You really should have called before coming over." I told her I had called. I told her she had not answered. I told her I needed her to come unlock my shed immediately. Her expression shifted into the particular kind of sympathetic condescension that I can only describe as her HOA face. She set her mug down on a little table by the door and said, "Kevin, I understand you're upset. But the board voted on this last month. Unapproved outbuildings that are not listed in the community's original development plan are subject to seizure and removal. Your shed has been in violation for quite some time, and we've been lenient. But given the circumstances," I asked her what circumstances justified locking my shed in the middle of a blizzard. She said, and I am not making this up, that precisely because of the blizzard, the board had determined this was an urgent public safety matter. She said my propane shed presented an explosion risk in severe weather. She said the HOA had the authority to secure any structure it deemed unsafe to the community. She said this all very calmly, like she was reading from a policy document she had memorized. I told her my shed was county permitted and code compliant and had been for 3 years. She smiled again and said permits from the county did not override HOA covenants. She said if I wanted to dispute it, I could submit a written appeal to the board which would be reviewed at the next quarterly meeting in approximately 10 weeks. 10 weeks. In a blizzard. At -4 degrees. I looked at her for a long moment. I said, Marlene, I have video of you using a bolt cutter to break into my property and enter my shed without my permission. That's breaking and entering. And the lock you've installed on my property is criminal mischief at a minimum. I'm going to give you one opportunity to walk over there with me right now and remove that lock before I call the police. She laughed. Not a mean laugh exactly, but the kind of laugh that says she thought I was being dramatic. She said the HOA had legal authority over community structures. She said the board's attorney had reviewed the policy. She said she was sorry I was upset and that she hoped I had a safe and warm day. Then she closed the door. I stood on her porch for a moment listening to the wind. Then I walked back to my house, sat down, and called the non-emergency police line. Except they told me that given the current conditions and the fact that roads were essentially closed, response time was going to be delayed. They took my information, gave me a reference number, and said they would send someone when they could. Fair enough. The roads were genuinely dangerous, so I did the next logical thing. I called my attorney. His name is Dave Riordan, and I keep him on a small retainer for exactly this kind of situation, because Marlene had been escalating for 2 years, and I had seen this coming in some form or another. Dave picked up on the third ring, which told me he was also already awake and probably dealing with storm stuff of his own. I explained the situation quickly. He told me 3 things. First, an HOA does not have the authority to physically seize a county-permitted and code-compliant structure. Second, breaking and entering a homeowner's locked structure and installing your own lock to prevent access is not a gray area. Third, I should document everything and he would have papers filed the moment the courts opened. While I had Dave on the phone, another alert came through on my Propane app. This one was different. It was from the sensor inside the shed, and it was telling me that one of my propane tanks, the large auxiliary tank, was showing an unusual pressure reading. Not dangerous, but unusual. Like something had been connected to it or the valve had been partially turned. My stomach dropped a little at that. I told Dave what the app was showing, and he said that added a potential utility tampering charge to the situation if we could prove it was Marlene. The video, however, was going to prove exactly that. I called my neighbor Tom Greer, who lives directly behind me and has a sight line to my shed from his back windows. Tom had already been up dealing with a snow-covered generator, and he came over within 20 minutes. He confirmed he had seen someone moving around near my shed before dawn. He had not known who it was at the time, but he had thought it was strange. I showed him the security footage and he watched it twice and said, "That is absolutely Marlene Baxter. I can see the pink coat and her specific walk. She always walks like she is marching in a parade." By mid-morning, word had gotten around the neighborhood the way it always does in these situations. Someone texts someone who tells someone else, and suddenly there is a group thread going with everyone from the street on it. By 11 in the morning, I had received messages from 9 different neighbors asking if it was true that Marlene had locked my propane shed during the blizzard. I confirmed it was true. The response was immediate and unified. People were furious. Not just on my behalf, either. People remembered that I had offered my backup propane system as a community resource in exactly this kind of emergency, and the idea that Marlene had locked that resource away from the neighborhood during an active blizzard was not going over well at all. The Hendersons texted me directly. Their heating system had started struggling that morning, exactly as I had feared. Their furnace was working but not keeping up. The old man, Frank Henderson, is 78 years old, and his wife Patricia has respiratory issues that are made significantly worse by the cold. They needed heat. I texted Frank back and told him the situation and that I was working on getting access back to my shed. I also told him to come over to my house in the meantime, that my indoor heating was running on a different system, and they were welcome to wait inside. Frank and Patricia bundled up and made the short trek through the snow and came in, and I got them settled in my living room with blankets and hot coffee. Sitting in my living room with two elderly people who needed warmth, because an HOA board president had decided to play bureaucracy games during a blizzard, was a specific kind of motivation. I went back to my phone, went back to my footage, and started putting together a complete documentation package. I had the security video. I had the monitoring app logs with timestamps. I had the alert notifications on my phone with timestamps. I had the photos I had taken of the shed and the new pink padlock. I had Dave's notes. I had Tom's statement, which he had put in writing for me in a text message. I had the county permit for the shed, which I had scanned into my files years ago. I had the original HOA CC and RS, which I had read carefully enough to know that the section Marlene was invoking had a specific carve-out for structures with valid county permits that predate the HOA enforcement action. That carve-out was important. The CC and RS said, and I am paraphrasing from memory here, but I had the actual document open in front of me, that the board could seek removal of unapproved outbuildings, but that any structure with a valid county building permit issued prior to a formal HOA notice of violation was considered a grandfathered structure and was not subject to seizure without a court order. I had never received a formal notice of violation about the shed. Not a single one. Not ever. Marlene had never put anything in writing about it before this morning. The quarterly meeting thing she mentioned was the first I had heard of any board action regarding my shed. So she had not only committed breaking and entering, she had also violated the HOA's own enforcement procedures. She had skipped the formal notice step entirely, gone straight to physical seizure, and done it without a court order, without a notice of violation, and without even a vote of the full board. I checked the bylaws. The board required 3 members present for a binding vote on enforcement actions of this nature. There were 5 board members total. Had all 5 voted? I had my doubts, because I was about to start making some phone calls. I called Linda Ochoa, who was another HOA board member and happened to be a relatively reasonable person who I had spoken to civilly several times in the past. She answered, and before I could even finish explaining the situation, she said she already knew. She had already received calls, and she had not voted for anything regarding my shed. She said Marlene had sent the board an email at 4 in the morning saying she was conducting an emergency safety action under the board president's authority and that it had already been handled. Linda said she had no idea Marlene was actually going to go out there with a bolt cutter. She said she was furious and that I needed to know the board was not behind this. That was interesting. So this was not even a rogue HOA board decision. This was Marlene Baxter acting entirely on her own in the pre-dawn hours of a blizzard to break into my shed and lock it with her own padlock. I asked Linda if she would put that in writing. She said absolutely, and she sent me a text message within 10 minutes confirming that the board had not voted on any enforcement action against my shed, that she had no knowledge of a planned physical seizure, and that she did not authorize or support what Marlene had done. I had now heard from 4 other board members by early afternoon, all of whom said some version of the same thing. Marcus Webb, who was the board treasurer, told me he had confronted Marlene directly over the phone, and she had told him she was acting under emergency authority provisions in the HOA bylaws. Marcus said he had checked those provisions and they absolutely did not cover this situation, and that he was frankly embarrassed to be associated with the HOA at this moment. At around 1 in the afternoon, a police cruiser managed to make it through the plowed section of our street. 2 officers, one young guy named Officer Dietrich and a more senior woman named Sergeant Velez, knocked on my door. I let them in, showed them everything. The footage, the app logs, the photos, the permit, the board member messages, all of it. They watched the security video twice. Sergeant Velez turned to Officer Dietrich and said quietly, "Yeah, that's breaking and entering. No question." She asked me if I wanted to press charges. I said yes. She asked if I had attempted to reach the individual first. I told her I had gone to Marlene's house directly and she had closed the door in my face. Sergeant Velez wrote some notes and said they would go speak with Marlene. I watched from my window as the cruiser made its way down the street to Marlene's house. I could not see what happened at her door from where I was standing, but about 20 minutes later I got a call from Officer Dietrich. He said Marlene had declined to remove the lock voluntarily and had informed them that the HOA had legal authority over community structures and that they should speak with the HOA's attorney. Sergeant Velez had apparently informed Marlene that the officers were not there about HOA policy, but about criminal trespass and criminal mischief, and potentially about breaking and entering, and that these were matters of state law, not community covenant documents. Dietrich said Marlene had then said some things that were probably not great for her situation, including that she had a right to protect the community from irresponsible homeowners, and that she had done what needed to be done. He said they were going to retrieve the lock, document the scene, and if the investigation supported it, a warrant would be sought. Within the hour, Officer Dietrich came back to my property with a pair of police-issue bolt cutters and cut the pink padlock off my shed. He bagged the padlock as evidence. I opened my shed and checked everything. The tanks were all there. The pressure readings confirmed what the app had told me. The auxiliary tank valve had been partially turned. Not all the way, but enough to notice, and the app data showed it matched the time of Marlene's visit. Dietrich photographed everything inside and added it to the documentation. He explained that the valve tampering raised the severity of what had happened, particularly given the weather conditions and the fact that propane system tampering during extreme cold could create safety risks. I thanked him. I went back inside where Frank and Patricia Henderson were still sitting in my living room. I told them the shed was open again and we could get them connected to the backup heat line. Tom Greer came over to help, and we spent about an hour in the brutal cold, running the connection from my propane system to the Henderson house through the line I had previously installed for that purpose. It was cold, exhausting work, and by the time we were done, my fingers were numb even through my insulated gloves. But when we tested the connection and Patricia Henderson's face relaxed as the warmth came on, every minute of it was worth it. By mid-afternoon, the neighborhood group chat had fully transformed into something I had never quite seen before. People who had been mildly tolerant of the HOA's overreach for years were done. I mean completely done. Messages were flying back and forth about the padlock, about the blizzard, about what could have happened to the Hendersons, about how this was not the first time Marlene had overstepped, but this was genuinely the most dangerous thing she had done. Someone posted a screenshot of the county permit for my shed with the text, "Fully legal and permitted," in big letters. Someone else posted a copy of the relevant CC and R clause about grandfathered structures. The neighborhood was doing its own legal research at this point. It was actually impressive. Marcus Webb, the board treasurer, sent a message to the group chat and publicly stated that the board had not authorized Marlene's actions, that he was calling an emergency board meeting, and that any enforcement action taken against me would be reviewed and reversed. Several people asked in the chat whether a vote of no confidence in Marlene was possible. Marcus confirmed that yes, according to the HOA bylaws, A board member could be removed by a 2/3 vote of the full membership, and that any homeowner could petition to call a special vote on board membership. I had not even asked for any of this. I was just trying to get my shed unlocked. Dave Riordan, my attorney, called me that evening to update me on the legal side of things. He said he had drafted a civil complaint that we could file as soon as the courthouse was accessible, citing trespass, conversion, interference with emergency utility systems, and intentional interference with a homeowner's property rights. He also said that the propane valve tampering, given the emergency weather conditions, had elevated this from a nuisance dispute to something considerably more serious. Tampering with a propane system during a declared winter emergency was not a small thing. Depending on how the DA chose to look at it, it could be charged under utility tampering statutes. I asked Dave what he thought the realistic outcome was. He said Marlene was facing potential criminal charges from the police investigation and a solid civil case from me. He said the HOA itself might face liability depending on whether Marlene could claim she was acting in any official capacity, but that the board members' written statements that they had not authorized her actions would significantly undercut that argument. He said my documentation was some of the best he had ever seen for this type of case, and that I should feel good about where we stood. I told him I did not feel good exactly. I felt tired and cold and frustrated that we had to be having this conversation at all. But I did feel prepared. The blizzard finally wound down around 9 that night. The snow had stopped falling, the wind had died to a low moan, and the temperature had actually come up about 5 degrees, which felt almost balmy compared to the morning. I stood at my back window with a glass of bourbon and looked at my shed sitting there in the snow, door closed properly, my own latch back in place, and I thought about how close it had come to being a much worse day. If I had not had the monitoring system, I might not have known about the lock for hours. If Tom had not been home, I might not have had a corroborating witness. If I had not kept all my permits and documents organized, I might have been scrambling to prove the shed was legal. And if I had not made that connection from my propane system to the Henderson house 2 winters ago, Frank and Patricia might have had a genuinely dangerous night. 3 days after the blizzard, the roads were cleared and things started moving again. Sergeant Velez called me to let me know that a criminal complaint had been filed against Marlene Baxter for breaking and entering and criminal mischief, and that a separate matter was being reviewed regarding the propane valve tampering. She said Marlene had been interviewed and had maintained throughout that she was acting in her capacity as HOA board president, and that the HOA's governing documents gave her authority to take emergency action on community structures. Velez said that argument had not landed well when examined against the actual language of the governing documents. She said Marlene would be required to appear in court, and that bail conditions had been set, meaning Marlene had actually been processed through the system. That was a moment. I had not been certain the criminal charges would go forward, because sometimes these disputes get treated as civil matters only. But between the documented trespass, the property damage from removing my original latch, the installation of her own lock on my property, and the propane valve tampering, the DA had decided this was worth pursuing criminally. The special membership vote to remove Marlene from the HOA board happened about 2 weeks later in the community center. It was the most well-attended HOA meeting in the history of Pinecrest Ridge, which is not saying much because usually these things pull in maybe 15 people who have nothing better to do on a Tuesday night. This one had over 90 homeowners in attendance, which was remarkable for a subdivision of our size. People came in still wearing their winter coats because the community center's heating was a little underpowered for a crowd that size, which was honestly a fitting detail given the circumstances. I did not give a speech. I did not need to. Marcus Webb ran the meeting and laid out the facts plainly. He explained what had happened on the morning of the blizzard. He explained that Marlene had acted without board authorization. He explained the criminal charges that had been filed. He explained the civil complaint that had been filed by my attorney. He explained the relevant sections of the CC and RS that Marlene had violated through her own enforcement process. He did not editorialize. He just presented the information. Then the floor was opened for comments. What followed was about 45 minutes of homeowners talking about their own experiences with Marlene's overreach over the past 2 years. The woman whose garden hose got her fined, that was me, but there were others. A family that had been cited for having holiday lights up 2 days past the HOA's specified takedown date. A retired couple who had been sent violation notices about their recycling bins being visible from the street, which was a rule that was not even in the CC and RS. A man who had been threatened with legal action over a bird feeder. And several people who talked about the general atmosphere of anxiety Marlene had created in the neighborhood, where people felt watched and judged, and at risk of fines for ordinary life. When the vote came, Marlene was removed from the board by a margin of 84-6. The 6 people who voted against removal were people I did not recognize, which made me suspect they might have been friends or family of Marlene who had come to vote in her support. Even so, 84-6 was not a close result. Marlene was not at the meeting. She had not been present and had sent a written statement through her own attorney asserting that the vote was improper and that she intended to challenge it. Marcus read the statement aloud. The room was quiet while he read it. Then he put it down and said the board's position was that the vote was entirely consistent with the HOA bylaws and that the board would be moving forward accordingly. A smattering of applause followed, which I thought was appropriate. In the weeks after, the civil case moved forward. Dave filed the complaint and Marlene's attorney responded with a motion to dismiss, arguing that Marlene had acted in good faith based on her understanding of HOA authority and that the damages were minimal. Dave responded to that motion with 37 pages of documentation including the security footage timestamps, the propane monitoring logs, the board member statements, the permit records, and an expert declaration from a propane safety consultant explaining why tampering with a propane valve during extreme cold weather was not a minimal risk matter. The motion to dismiss was denied. The criminal case proceeded more slowly, as criminal cases do. But when it finally reached a resolution, it was through a plea agreement. Marlene pled guilty to criminal mischief in the 2nd degree and a reduced charge on the trespass. She received a fine, community service, and a 2-year probationary period. The propane valve tampering was addressed as part of the plea, factoring into the sentencing conditions. She was not sent to jail, which I think was the right outcome honestly. I did not need Marlene to go to jail. I needed her to face real consequences for what she had done, and a criminal conviction and probation qualified as real consequences. The civil settlement came through about a month after the criminal plea. Marlene's insurance covered part of it, and she paid the rest personally. The settlement covered my legal fees, the cost of the latch she had damaged, and a sum for the trespass itself. I asked Dave if there was a way to designate part of the settlement toward a community heating assistance fund for the neighborhood, something that could help people like the Hendersons in future emergencies. Dave said that was entirely possible. So the settlement included a provision where a portion of the money went into an account that would be administered by the HOA, now under new and better leadership, to help residents with emergency heating costs. I thought that was a pretty good outcome. The woman who had tried to lock away my emergency heating resources during a blizzard ended up funding the neighborhood's emergency heating assistance program. There is something deeply satisfying about that kind of resolution. The HOA itself went through some genuine changes after all of this. Marcus Webb was elected board president in Marlene's place, and he immediately set about revising the enforcement procedures to require documented written notice before any enforcement action, mandatory full board votes for any action involving physical structures, and a prohibition on any board member acting unilaterally under claimed emergency authority, without first attempting to contact at least 2 other board members. He also added a provision that the board could not take any enforcement action against a county-permitted structure without first obtaining a legal opinion confirming that the action was within the HOA's authority. These were common-sense changes that should have been in place from the beginning, but they were in place now, and that mattered. I went back and talked to the propane monitoring company after everything settled down. I told them what had happened and how their system had been central to catching what Marlene had done. The representative I spoke with was genuinely stunned. She said in her 8 years with the company, she had never heard of the monitoring system being used to document a break-in. She asked if she could share the story internally as a case study. I said sure, as long as she protected my identifying details. She said their security alert features might get some more attention in the marketing materials going forward. I told her she was welcome to it. Tom Greer became one of my closest friends through all of this, which was a silver lining I had not anticipated. We had been friendly before, but mostly just the wave from the driveway kind of friendly. After spending that blizzard day working together on the Henderson heating connection, and then going through the neighborhood meeting experience together, we had built something more substantial. Tom started a neighborhood watch group that had nothing to do with the HOA, which was a point he made explicitly at the first meeting. It was just neighbors looking out for each other, sharing information about what was happening on the street, and coordinating on things like snow clearing and emergency preparedness. The Hendersons came to the first neighborhood watch meeting. Frank Henderson shook my hand when he arrived and held it for a moment and said, "You kept us warm, son. We won't forget it." That was worth more to me than any settlement check. Spring eventually came, because it always does, and with it came the kind of neighborhood that Pinecrest Ridge should have been all along. People were talking to each other. The group chat was full of useful information and occasional jokes instead of complaint threads about HOA citations. Marcus ran a spring community cleanup event that had real volunteer turnout. Someone organized a block cookout for the end of April. The matching mailboxes and quarterly newsletter still existed, but they felt like details of a pleasant community now rather than surveillance apparatus. My propane shed sat in the back corner of my property as it had for 3 years, county permitted, code compliant, fully operational, and connected to the Henderson house via the backup line we had run. The monitoring system hummed along quietly, keeping track of pressure levels and tank temperatures and door events, doing its job in the background the way good systems do. Every now and then I would open the app just to check in, see all the green indicators lined up in a row, and remember the morning it had sent me an alert at 5:15 and changed everything. I had a new latch on the shed door, a heavy-duty one that I had installed myself. I had also added a secondary camera specifically aimed at the shed after the incident, in addition to the existing corner camera. Total overkill for a propane shed, probably, but I have never regretted being prepared. The irony of the whole situation, the thing I kept coming back to, was that Marlene had picked the absolute worst possible target for her power grab. She had not chosen a neighbor who would be intimidated by HOA authority. She had not chosen someone without documentation. She had not chosen someone without legal counsel or community relationships or a monitoring system that logged everything. She had chosen the one house in the neighborhood that was probably the most thoroughly documented and legally defensible property in the subdivision. And she had done it during a blizzard, when the stakes were real and visible to everyone, when the evidence of what her actions could cost the community was sitting right there in the form of 2 elderly people who needed heat. If Marlene had wanted to pick a fight with me over the shed, she could have sent a letter. She could have followed the procedures. She could have raised the issue at a board meeting and had a real conversation. I would have pulled out my permit and the CC and R clause, and she would have had very little to stand on. But at least we would have handled it like adults. Instead, she went out in a blizzard at 5 in the morning with a bolt cutter and a pink padlock, and thought she was going to outmaneuver a guy who had been waiting for this moment for 2 years with a filing cabinet full of evidence. That is the thing about people like Marlene. They mistake authority for invincibility. They get so used to other people backing down, so accustomed to the power they have accumulated through meetings and bylaws, and the general human tendency to avoid conflict, that they stop believing anyone will actually push back. They stop doing the math. They stop asking themselves what happens if the person they are targeting is actually prepared. I was prepared. And a propane monitoring app, a security camera, a competent attorney, and a neighborhood that had been waiting for someone to draw a line were all standing right behind me. By the time the following winter rolled around, Pinecrest Ridge was genuinely different. The new board had established a formal emergency preparedness committee, which I agreed to chair, because it turned out I was the person in the neighborhood who had thought most carefully about this kind of thing. We created a community resource map showing which households had backup heating, generators, or other emergency resources, and who had offered to make those resources available to neighbors during emergencies. We coordinated with the local fire department on propane safety education after the incident had drawn some attention. We established a phone tree for wellness checks on elderly residents during extreme weather events. The first major snowstorm of that new winter hit on a Thursday night in December. It was not as bad as the blizzard from the year before, but it was a solid 1.5 feet of snow with temperatures in the single digits. I was up early again that Friday morning, standing at my kitchen window with my coffee, watching the snow settle. My phone was quiet. No alerts from the propane system. No unexpected visitors in my backyard. Just the neighborhood, white and still, with smoke rising from chimneys and the blue glow of early morning lights in windows where people were waking up and starting their days. The Henderson house had lights on. Frank always got up early. I could see the warm yellow of his kitchen window across the snowy yards, and it occurred to me that the light was possible partly because of the propane line we had run, partly because of everything that had happened over the past year, and partly because neighbors had decided that taking care of each other mattered more than citing each other over garden hoses. My phone buzzed. It was the neighborhood group chat. Tom Greer had posted a message that said he was heading out to plow the street with his truck if anyone wanted their driveways done. 3 people immediately responded asking if he needed help. Someone else asked if the Hendersons needed their walkway shoveled. Someone else posted that they had extra firewood if anyone needed it. Someone posted a weather update and a list of which county roads were already plowed. I put my coffee down and went to get my boots. There was shoveling to do, neighbors to check on, and a community that had figured out how to be one. The propane shed stood in the back corner of my yard, its door properly latched, its tanks all reading green on the app, its monitoring system quietly doing its job. It had never been just a storage shed. It had been a resource, a plan, a piece of preparedness that I had built because I believed in taking care of things before they became crises. It had been tested in the most unexpected way possible, and it had held. Marlene Baxter was gone from the board, gone from any position of authority in Pinecrest Ridge, and completing her community service hours at a local food bank on Saturdays. I did not think about her very often anymore. When I did, it was mostly with a kind of distant, bemused feeling, the way you might think about a bad storm that had passed and left the ground cleaner than it had been before. I grabbed my shovel. Outside, the snow was brilliant white in the early light, the sky clearing to the east, the kind of cold, crisp morning that made your breath visible in long white clouds and made the whole world feel sharp and clear and exactly as it should be. Pinecrest Ridge was going to be just fine.